Hi, I'm Mike Ammerlaan. I'm a program manager on the Excel and Office Web Components team. And what I'll talk today is about how you can use the Office 10 Web Components in your programmability solutions, doing server-side calculation and business intelligence applications. I'm going to focus in on the new features we've done on the Office 10 Web Components, so that to an extent kind of assumes that you know what was going on with the Office 9 Web Components, the Office 2000 Web Components, I should say. And but I'll try to refer back to where our limitations were, what the changes are from Office 2000, so that you might have a background in the entire story that we're trying to present for the Office Web Components. So briefly, what I'll start is with an agenda and the topics we're going to cover. As I mentioned, we really tried to target two core scenarios with the Office Web Components in the 10.0 version of Office. To begin with, when we first started the Office 2000, Office 9 Web Components, we had this vision of being able to publish rich, interactive web solutions from Office documents. So from Excel primarily, and to a lesser extent, building a great interactive analysis solutions in front page and access. We had mixed success with kind of trying to target that strategy. But what we really found with the Office Web Components was that people took them and they built really great solutions off of them. So people who were, web page developers, savvy IT people in their corporations, to a very large degree, the Office Web Components were a boon to them because, first of all, they installed with Office and thus were very omnipresent on a lot of machines, but also, did a lot of the things that they were looking for and were designed for the web page environment. So in the Office 10 Web Components, that was really kind of our core focus in evolving the web components. So both of our scenarios that we really targeted had the fundamental premise that people are going to take the Office Web Components and develop solutions on top of them. Going to do some web page scripting with the end result of trying to create custom solutions in a large organization. So one of the first core scenarios that we tried to address was server-side calculation. What we've seen a lot of people try to do with Excel is try to do calculation that's done, for example, on a server side. A good example, at least internally, is the MS Expense application, which uses Excel to a degree to process your expense reports. But the problem with Excel on a server side is that it really wasn't designed to work on the server, and as such has very undesirable traits in the server environment. One being it's a very large application, and two that it can cause crashes or at least slow memory leaks, which are really huge issues on a server-side environment. The Office spreadsheet component in 9.0 offered the promise of being able to do server-side calculation. But there was still enough issues in this version 1.0 component, so to speak, because it was the first, this brand new code base. There's enough limitations there that people really couldn't use them in the ways they wanted to. There were some certain showstoppers there. I'll discuss those later on. So in the 10.0 component, we really did as much work as possible to try to address those limitations so that people could, for example, design Excel models and do server-side calculations based on those Excel models that maybe someone in the accounting department who wasn't terribly IT savvy had designed and reuse those on the server side. But next I'll also cover web-based corporate reporting. We've got a chart and pivot table component in the Office Web Components stable as well. And these are basically designed to do business intelligence reporting in an organization. So of course, charting allows you to get at a very quick view, a very visual view of what's currently going on with your data. Pivoting is also very important to be able to do analyses of the data as it exists and get down to the fine-grained numbers and the totals that you're looking for. So we basically took the chart and pivot components and evolved them in a general direction. I mean, as I mentioned, the Office Web Components were introduced with Office 9, and as such, were a brand new code base and kind of a V1 product, so to speak. For version 2, we still had a lot of work to do to add features to them, to give them the kind of feature set that people were really looking for. So I'll discuss web-based corporate reporting and the new chart and pivot features in that context. Finally, I'll talk about licensing and installation, always popular topics with the Office Web Components because people have a lot of questions about our licensing model, which in the past had a lot of issues with it. It still has a lot of interesting things to know, and also how do you install the Office Web Components. So I'll start with server-side calculation. As I had mentioned, we want to be able to allow people to build a spreadsheet model in Excel which is a tool for building mathematical models that the vast majority of people are very familiar with. But then take it and calculate it on the server. Now there's probably 4 good examples of why you'd want to do calculation on the server. So one of them is to do middle tier processing. As I mentioned, MS Expense is a good example where someone creates a model or fills out a form in Excel, and on the middle tier you want to actually calculate that. So you want to extract, for example, what the expense total was and kind of put that into your database and store and do calculations on that. You can always do middle tier processing no matter what happens, but when you've got a spreadsheet object on the server, that makes it a heck of a lot easier to say, okay, you do the calculation and I'll just get the values, rather than having to try to do calculations in VBScript and JavaScript. Calculating on the server is also important for doing long-running calculations. So a lot of corporations, they've got very extensive, very processor-intensive models, and what they do today is they actually have Excel and they run it for a few hours. But it would be even better if we had this lightweight component that was designed just to do robust calculations quickly, that didn't have the issues of the potential for failures, the potential for the user interface of Excel to kind of throw up alerts and stop calculation and those kinds of things. Repeated calculations is similar to long-running calculations where, for example, you want to do a Monte Carlo calculation where you want to run a high number of trials of a certain calculation to see, using random numbers in the process to see what distributions might be. And finally, a calculation engine is something that you can use to power interactive yet lightweight websites. So a good scenario is, for example, you are an insurance company and you have a whole bunch of employees who need to look at an actuarial table to say, okay, well, is this a good risk in terms of insurance? Are they a smoker? How old are they? Have they had any problems? So if you wanted to design a website to do that, what you'd want is an input form to kind of input all that information. But you probably want to do some kind of extensive calculations. And instantiating a Office spreadsheet component on the server would allow you to do that without having to basically hard code all that logic and make it inaccessible to the people who know how to design your model via the actuaries, for example. So that's server-side calculation. So what did we really do in terms of features to address that scenario? Well, number 1 priority for us was Excel compatibility with the spreadsheet. If you want to fulfill the scenario where people can take a model in Excel and load it into the spreadsheet and do calculation, you can't have issues like, well, it calculated in Excel in one way, but in the spreadsheet it calculates a different way. That's really pretty bad. If you're familiar with the Office 9 web component, we had some very obvious limitations. First of all was that we had a different calculation engine in 9. It was basically a different code base. But in 10, what we did is we built a new calculation engine. First of all, it's a lot faster, which is important for those long-running processes or those Monte Carlo operations. But it's also based on the Excel code base. So that means that there's a low probability that you'll get different numbers in Excel versus the web component, because we're using, to a large degree, the same code. And finally, there's just a lot of areas of feature completeness that we didn't get to in the calculation engine and the spreadsheet component in 2000 that we've addressed and fixed in the 10.0 web component. So things like array formulas and 3D references across sheets, you can now do those, and also named ranges as well. Another really big feature limitation of 2000 that we've addressed is workbooks. So when people design complex models in Excel, they want to divide, first of all, maybe the data on one sheet and the model that does calculations on another. It's a very clean way to design a calculating model. But if you have only one sheet, in the spreadsheet component, that makes porting your calculation solution very tough. Because you have to basically squish that model that you've spent so much time designing onto one sheet, and that's not a trivial thing in a lot of cases. So in the Office 10 web component, we've got support for workbooks, so multiple sheets. And finally, another thing that we have is an Excel-compatible object model. So what that means is basically we've paid a lot of attention to trying to make sure that the properties and the methods on the spreadsheet component work in as many ways as possible as their Excel counterparts, with the goal of being able to take, for example, VBA macros you've written in Excel and make them run against the spreadsheet component. Now, of course, it's not 100% mapping. Excel, first of all, has a lot of history. It's got things like Mac compatibility, which require properties on certain objects that, don't really make sense for the spreadsheet component. Other things like, a load method on a workbook that, takes takes a lot of parameters which just really don't make sense for us. So we've tried to make it as compatible as possible with Excel. I mean, on the other hand, it is also not, it's not seamless either, but it's substantially improved. Now, I will say that the downside to trying to make our Excel compatible object model is that thus the object model for the spreadsheet component in 10 has changed substantially from 9, which of course means that you'd need to convert solutions that you had built. But we've also innovated on the spreadsheet 10 and tried to put into there new features that allow you to do more in calculation. First of all, there's spreadsheet XML support. This is actually a feature that Excel has as well, but in Office 10. That's essentially the ability to take a spreadsheet and save it as an XML stream. We've got a new file format, or a new data format, it's probably called spreadsheet XML, which is basically a representation of an Excel workbook. Now, the philosophy in designing the spreadsheet XML format was that we wanted to make it as easy as possible for developers to kind of understand and be able to render. So, for example, what's the easiest way that a developer would expect that named ranges would be represented in spreadsheet XML? We tried to, design that into our XML format so that, for example, developers would have an easy time, using an active server page to, and VB script to kind of render custom workbooks in spreadsheet XML. So the spreadsheet component also shares this file format, so this data format. So that makes it easy to get data out of the spreadsheet component, do processing on it, or, for example, to use an active server page that generates spreadsheet XML and place it into the spreadsheet web component. I will say that one of the features we wanted to do but do not do in the Office spreadsheet component is support for XLS loading, essentially. It's a very important feature. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to kind of get it into the product. But there is spreadsheet XML, which also has its own advantages and is very flexible. Another feature that spreadsheet 10 has that's important to customers who have really big models is support for more rows and columns. Easily probably one of the biggest limitations of Excel is that you only have support for 65,000 rows. In the spreadsheet component, we've got support for 260,000 rows and 18,000 columns, or up to ZZZ as a column name. So that allows you to have more flexibility in building models in your spreadsheet component. For example, a lot of our financial customers, they want to do a model based on the Russell 2000 index, which implies that you have 2,000 columns. Well, in Excel, you can only support up to 256 columns. Thus, it becomes very hard to do it. So another feature that we have is data-bound sheets. What we found a lot of people doing with the Office spreadsheet component is they take the spreadsheet component, and the first thing they do is instantiate ADO, they connect to a database, they get a record set out, and then they have to by hand kind of pour that data into a spreadsheet. So what we've done is make that process a lot easier by providing properties whereby you can bind a sheet to a table in a database. This really saves you from a lot of work. It doesn't necessarily provide new scenarios, but it is indicative of our focus on making it very easy for people to leverage the spreadsheet component in a solution. Another really innovative feature, a feature that we're really kind of proud of, is iDispatch as a cell type. So in Excel, you can have the common cell types like string or value or data, but we also support iDispatch, or COM object, so to speak, as a cell type. So in cell A1 here in this bitmap, what you can see is we've put in an iDispatch object, a msxml.dom document object. That gets displayed as you can see, object DOM document. Now that's just basically an iDispatch object. Then in other cells, what you can do is build formulas that work against it. So what you see in A3, for example, is, if you've ever worked with MSXML, you can immediately recognize it is a call to certain properties and methods on the MSXML object, .select single node. It's not just limited to MSXML, but it's basically any kind of iDispatch object within reason, and with while still conforming to security issues within the Internet Explorer environment. If you're hosting it within Internet Explorer, the object has to be safe for scripting if you're hosting the control in Internet Explorer. But you can also use it, for example, to bind to the Internet Explorer object model if that's what you'd like to do. Okay, so that was a quick summary of the spreadsheet features that we've developed in Office 10 to kind of round out the spreadsheet calculation scenario that we're really targeting, and basically with an emphasis on how do we make it easy for developers to reuse our components. Now I'll move into corporate reporting scenario enhancements. again, people use the chart and pivot components in web-based solutions very readily. There's companies that take the Office web components and with a good layer of logic on top of them, they can resell them as full-fledged business intelligence solutions. So what we've tried to do in honing our vision for the Office 10 web components is make it easy for the developers to reuse the components and give them the features that they really are looking for. To an extent, for chart and pivot, we had a good feature set in 9, but there's obviously a lot of features missing. And to an extent, the kind of things that we want to do in chart and pivot were kind of obvious. For example, in charting, we didn't support 3D charts, but people still want to do 3D charts, of course. So that's an obvious feature for us. So I'll start with the chart features. As I mentioned, we support 3D charts and fill effects. The fill effect engine is actually the same fill effect engine that Excel uses, so you'll see a lot of compatibility there. This obviously allows you to create a lot more aesthetic reports, and also to be able to view more data at a given time if you're assuming a 3D chart. So those were two very big features that brought us up to the Office level of feature support for charting. But again, we also want to provide some new features that are not in Excel that make a chart a very valuable component as well. So one of them, for example, is custom drawing. So that's basically enough object model, enough events and properties that you can take control of any point in when chart draws and draw your own things on a chart. So for example, a lot of people want to do a step chart, which it looks kind of like a column chart, but is actually just stepped lines. We never had support for a step chart, so of course, before Office 10, people were kind of out of luck. There's no way to do step charts in the charting component. But now we've got support for custom drawing, so you can override the drawing of how when the chart component draws columns in your column chart and say, well, just don't fill in beneath them, so you get a step chart effect. But again, it's a full-fledged object model, so you can do all kinds of things. Render completely new chart types. You can basically draw objects on your chart that are tied to certain bits of data within it. So as you, for example, rotate a 3D chart, your drawing object sticks with your column. All kinds of smart behavior like that. Another similar feature is format maps in charting. So when you build a traditional chart, you associate things like how many columns are in my chart, what goes on the series, what goes in the data. But what format maps allow you to do is associate data values with even more stuff, specifically the formatting properties of data within the chart. You can see in this bitmap here of a chart, what we've done is essentially take a certain set of values for what the opening gross was for movies and associate that with the color of the stars that you see in the chart. So this gives you the capability to have another dimension of data packed into your charts that you can see. So when you look at this chart, you see it's very interesting to see the distribution of how movies make money. But when you focus on the color of the stars, you can actually glean more information from the chart as well. Pivot chart support was another big area for charting. The Excel 9 actually introduced really good pivot chart features, but the Web Components 9 didn't. In 10, we've actually added full pivot chart support. So this gives you the experience that's very similar to a pivot table of being able to look at a list of fields in your database and drag and drop them onto your chart to quickly build new charts, or to drill down on existing charts. So what you can see here in this bitmap is we've got the familiar drop zones for being able to drop in new filters or drop in new series. And you see we also have features like filtering. So salesperson has that familiar triangle that is blue if it's been filtered, those kinds of things. Very quickly, what you can see on this chart is another very important feature of our charting engine, which the Excel engine doesn't share, which is the support for multi-charts. So another dimension of information is that you can say, well, show me two or more charts that are based on people, for example. So here you see two charts, one for Ann Dodsworth, one for Nancy DeVolio. So you can see side by side what their sales performance might have been. And that gives you another way to kind of have another dimension of being able to look at your data. Now I'll move on to the pivot features. Pivoting is the component I work on, so this is kind of what I'm familiar with. But again, the theme is very similar. In 9.0, it was almost self-evident the kind of features that we were missing compared to Excel, to say nothing of even more advanced pivoting clients like Cognos tools, for example. So one of the features that we introduced with Pivot is grouping. We've really worked on our grouping and filtering features. One is ad hoc grouping, so the ability to create new groups based on your data that might not necessarily have existed in your underlying data. So either in your OLAP cube or your relational data source. So here you can see the all too familiar Food Mart OLAP cube, which, as you may know, has country with state underneath it, with city underneath it, and name underneath that. But what you might be interested in is these things that you work with a lot, which is sales district, for example. So what a developer can do, or what an end user can do, is create a new ad hoc group that sits in between state and city and provides more meaningful groupings that might be interesting to your customers. We've also enhanced with other grouping features as well. So we also support interval grouping. So what an interval grouping allows you to do is to do a different type of grouping, but based on certain intervals. A really good example, for example, it comes back to that movie database. So each movie, for example, opens in a certain number of theaters. Maybe it opens in one theater, maybe it opens in 500 theaters, maybe a movie opens nationwide, so thus it opens in maybe 3,000 theaters. But that's kind of a really interesting point of analysis because it's kind of a rough indicator of how big a movie is. But the problem is that any given movie might start in any random number of theaters. So maybe one movie opens up in 302 theaters, another opens up in 304. So you can't really do any kind of interesting grouping based on that in 9.0. But with interval grouping, you really can. You can say, we'll do a grouping based on the number of opening theaters, but show me them grouped by the small films, which opened up in between 1 and 500 theaters, the larger films, which opened up in between 500 and 2,500 theaters, and the blockbuster, Titanic-style movies, which opened nationwide instantly, for example, and opened up in 3,500 theaters, let's say. So you can do interval grouping. That allows you to basically do analysis where you really couldn't before based on your data. Finally, another feature in grouping is the ability to custom order group members. So, for example, oftentimes you'll see kind of you'll be able to sort database on alphabetic or numerical scales, but that's kind of not interesting in a lot of cases. You think about education level, where you're trying to do grouping based on whether they've got a high school degree or a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree, those kinds of things. If you sort them in alphabetical order, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense because bachelor's degree comes first, followed by high school degree. And for customers, it's kind of hard to look at that and say, okay, well, what's going on here? But with the Pivot 10, we've actually added support at the programmatic level and at the user interface level so that people can do their own custom ordering and custom sorting. This really, again, is a super key feature that people really need to analyze their data, and we've opened up a new avenue to do it. Filtering was probably one of our biggest Achilles heels in the 9.0 component in terms of not having enough features. And with the 10.0 component, we've basically revised and kind of greatly enhanced the filtering model. So one of the key ones that you can do in Excel and other analysis clients is top-end, bottom-end conditional filtering. So you want to find out, for example, what are my top 5 salespeople? In the 9.0 component, there's really no way to do that. But with 10, we've got great object model support so that you can say, well, show me my top 5 salespeople on a per city basis or on a nationwide basis or per state. Total flexibility in designing the filters that you want. You can also have multiple filters per field. So for example, in 10, when you put something on the filter axis to do filtering on, you can only select one thing from it. So maybe you wanted to see, what your 2 salespeople, Ann Dodsworth and Nancy DeVolio, were doing. Well, you can only select one at a time and look at the numbers for them. But with 10, we've got basically support so that you can say, well, in one pivot table, select Nancy DeVolio and Ann Dodsworth together and show me their data. So you can actually do multiple filters per field. Again, a really core thing that a lot of people wanted to do, and now you can do it with a pivot table 10 web component. We have support for an OLAP feature, so the ability to kind of show metadata on certain members within your database. So imagine for a moment that you're analyzing the performance of your supermarkets. You run a supermarket chain, and you want to find out you basically want to find out more about the customers who are buying products from your stores. Well, what a pivot table allows you to do is drill down very quickly to say, well, show me my customers in Berkeley, California, for example. But what member properties allow you to do is actually find out more about them that you might know, the metadata about them. So here you can see Alma Shelton, but we've actually got more data in our database than that. We know what her gender is, whether she's married or not, and those kinds of things. And now with Pivot Table 10, you can support them. You can show them directly on your pivot table. You can also do other things like, for example, not show them directly on the pivot table, but when you hover over Alma Shelton, you'll get her member property information. Of course, also programmatically, you can get at that information and perhaps maybe show it directly on a web page. So another feature that we've looked at doing is calculated totals and fields. So an OLAP pivot table, the role for it is that it has these predefined totals that make doing very quick analysis possible. But maybe sometimes you want to do some ad hoc analysis on your own. You can get at the profit and you can get at the sales count very easily, but let's say for a moment that you wanted to find out what's the average profit for each item that we sell. Well, with calculated totals, we allow, first of all, an end user to kind of build a new calculation that's based on, for example, profit and sales count, and show that directly on the pivot table. So what you see here, for example, is that a person has designed a new measure called profit per item. And they've defined it using kind of OLAP MDX syntax to say, take the measures.profit and divide that by the sales count, and thus they get a new measure in their pivot table. Now what you can see here is another important point that I'll digress a little bit on. And that's to say that we do have user interface in the pivot table for doing all these kinds of things, like, for example, building a calculated total. But the user interface is fairly simple. It's nowhere near as nice and as easy to use as like an Excel formula building, as Excel's formula building tools are. Part of the reason for that is that we really want to kind of focus in on doing the programmatic features and at least exposing the functionality on one level so that solution developers can, in turn, build richer solutions. So if, for example, doing calculated totals is really important for a certain customer, a web page developer can develop their own user interface, and that's even richer for building calculated totals. But maybe if it's not so much of a priority, they can fall back on our user interface, which certainly is good and gets the job done, but might not be as rich as they wanted. Again, the focus is on making the pivot table, the Office Web Components, first of all, great components for solutions. We also support doing calculated fields. So basically, you can create a new field that you might want to group on, and you can base that on other fields or other totals in your database, and you can use VBA expressions to build those. Those only apply in the relational only case. That's not for when you're going up against an OLAP data source. Other new pivot features that we've really worked on in the Office 10 Web Components. Well, one of our features is that we have write-only custom MDX support. So a lot of times, people who are very fluent with MDX, which is basically like SQL but for OLAP databases, people who are very fluent with it, they can really spit out the MDX and they know it off the top of their head, and they want to pour that into the pivot table component and say, well, show me a view based on this. So what we do is we allow that intent. We say, well, what you can do is you can render your own custom MDX, and you can generate it and pour it into the component. Now, what we don't have is MDX read support. So the pivot table component, for example, is this very rich control for basically hiding from you how it builds MDX so that it can show you a view. And people say, well, wouldn't it be great if we could actually get the MDX out of the pivot table component so that we can do further things based on it? But the pivot table component doesn't really give us a way to get out a single MDX statement. The reason is that the pivot table has a lot of optimizations, and as such, when it builds a view, it might send multiple MDX statements to an OLAP cube. Thus, at any given point for a pivot table, we can't stop and say, well, give us just one MDX statement for it. So as a result, there is no MDX read support in the pivot table 10 web component. There is a way to log the multiple MDX statements that it's using to build its views, but that's not as useful to a lot of people. Now, a lot of people come to us and say, well, I'd like read MDX support and I'd like write MDX support, because what they want to do is take our MDX and put it into a database. So if someone with a pivot table, they build a view that they like, and they want to get the MDX out so they can store it in the database, and then later on say, load that report that I just created, and it takes the MDX, puts it into the web component, and they get the view back again. But a lot of times what people don't know is that we've got this property on the pivot table called .xml data, which allows you to get the state of the pivot table component, what filter on which axis, what's the state of my filters, which is an XML stream which you can stuff into a SQL database, in which you can take out and use to kind of restore a pivot table. So that's a very common feature that we have in our pivot table web component, the commonly requested feature. Again, sometimes people are looking for slightly different functionality for MDX. Finally, there's this other analysis feature that we have in our pivot table 10 feature set. That is the ability to show data as a percent. So a lot of times, for example, you'll see numbers for the data that you're interested in. So let's say we want to see how our salespeople are doing, and we want to see who's selling the most product. Well, when you have a very long list of your salespeople, you'll see a lot of numbers that go along with them, and it's not necessarily obvious, when you look at those numbers and try to compare them visually, who's got the best sales, those kinds of things. So what we have is another way to kind of analyze the data in addition to filtering and sorting, which is to be able to show that data as a percent. So rather than showing, for example, how much money Nancy DeVolio sold last year to our customers, we can say, well, how much did she sell as a percentage of the total sales that we made? So then you can actually do kind of a relative comparison. You can say, well, Nancy DeVolio sold 20% of our goods last year, which is a lot more meaningful to you maybe than just saying, well, she sold $200,000 worth of goods last year. So that's a really important analysis feature that people have been looking for. You can do show data as percent based on column totals, based on row totals, and you really have the flexibility to kind of get that data in any form you really want to. Very briefly, I'll go over the new features that we've done that are in all of our components that are shared amongst them. These are basically programmability hooks that we've placed in the components that really are oriented towards the solution developers. They really have no client-side equivalents that people can look at. So one of them is completely redone property pages. So a lot of times when we developed the Office 9 web components, we tried to design the property page user interface, which allows you to do things with the controls. And it was based in HTML. But what we found is when people try to open that thing, it instantiates a copy of Internet Explorer, which in turn has to load up some HTML. And that kind of can be a little slow, and it wasn't really optimal. Moreover, it did cause some bugs. It did cause a lot more issues than we would have expected. So what we did for 10 was we completely redid our property pages. So now they're Win32-based property pages, very quick to load up. And also, they conform to property page standards for controls. What that means is that when you insert the pivot table component into Visual Basic and right-click on it and ask for the property pages, you'll get those property pages that we've designed, and that allows you to more quickly build the pivot table if you're using it in a container like Visual Basic. Again, the focus on our property pages is to make it possible for people to design pivot tables within Visual Basic and front page, but we also anticipate that in a lot of circumstances people will not want to show our property pages in an end product, but rather design their own user interface, which is more targeted to their customers and can, for example, take into account that people want to do certain things with our features rather than very broad-based calculations, for example. We have an extensible toolbar in the Office 10 web components. So what this means is, for example, you can add new buttons to the toolbar. You can remove buttons from our toolbar. The toolbar that we've used is based on the Microsoft Common Controls ComCuddle toolbar. So if you've got familiarity with that, you'll be right at home with the toolbar that we've integrated into our product. This is really important because, for example, maybe you don't want to show property pages to your customers because you've designed your own user interface and you don't want them to have broad control of the pivot table. Well, in 9, basically what you would see is maybe a property to disable the property pages, but you'd still see a grayed out item on the toolbar, which is not optimal if ultimately you don't want people to ever load those property pages. So for example, it makes it really easy to remove the property pages icon from that toolbar, so your users never have to deal with the overhead of, well, there's this thing on the toolbar that I could push, but it's never enabled for me to do. If you're familiar with ComCuddle toolbars, you know that it's got this other ActiveX component called an image list. And the image list is kind of a image library control that allows you to manipulate the images so that you can place them onto the toolbar. One problem that we encountered was that our image list doesn't necessarily support loading of images from an HTTP site. So this does cause a problem to a degree because if you're trying to host a web component on a web page and building a custom analysis solution, you'd want to be able to say, for example, I want to get these icons from a GIF images that I've stored on my web server, and you want to programmatically load those into the image list. But it turns out you really can't. Thus, it becomes a little difficult if you're designing a web page to build a toolbar based on GIF images you've stored on your web server. There's really no good answer for that problem, and that's kind of an unfortunate flaw we have. I mean, if you're doing it in Visual Basic, it's not too tough to use that image list to get the images you want. But since you can't load them from an HTTP server, when you're building a web page, it limits that scenario. We've got extensible context menus. So, of course, the theme is that you can customize all kinds of user interfaces that the web components expose. So extensible context menus mean that you can remove items from the context menu, you can add them. We also do support cascading, for example, so that you can have a cascaded submenu off a custom menu that you want. The way the context menus are designed in the pivot table web components is that they're based on VB arrays, so you pass into it an array into the web components. Unfortunately, array support between VBScript and JavaScript is a little strange in that VB arrays use VBScript uses traditional VB arrays, which JavaScript uses a different type of array and can't natively use those VB arrays. But the JavaScript language does have some primitives to allow you to convert from a VB array to a JavaScript array. So if you're designing a solution and you're writing JavaScript and you want to customize the context menus, what you have to keep in mind is that you're going to have to use the VB array object in JavaScript to convert from the arrays that we're using. Makes it a little bit tough, but it's good to mention because otherwise it might trip you up and cause you to have to spend a lot more time doing context menus than you might want. Finally, we've done general programmability component improvements to make the pivot table more accessible. A good case in point is support for command architecture. A lot of other ActiveX controls, like for example the Trident edit control, have support for command architecture. This is basically, what it means is basically a list of commands that are exposed from the user interface that you might want to provide to your users. So for example, cut and copy and paste are three commands that are exposed from the toolbars, but they really don't have kind of object model correspondence. There's really no way to kind of automate cut, copy, and paste. But with a command architecture, you have this basic way to say, pivot table do a cut operation or pivot table do a copy operation. So it brings the components to the next level of being able to automate it, because then you can truly automate anything that the pivot table can do. So for example, you can turn off our toolbar and maybe show your own toolbar and do things like cut, copy, and paste, even though we don't have direct object model support for doing those things. So changes to licensing. Licensing is a fairly interesting topic for the web components. And to start off the discussion, I'll talk about our Office 2000 licensing. So for Office 2000, it was required that you have an Office 2000 license per install of the web components. So if someone didn't ever buy Office 2000, really, they shouldn't ever be able to install Office 2000. You'd violate the Office 2000 web components because you would violate the license. And moreover, if you built, for example, a server-side web solution that used HTML user interface to build a chart so that you could show different types of charts, which on the server side you had a chart object that drew charts based on that HTML user interface, that was considered kind of an interactive use of the Office web components. And according to the licensing model, that would have required that the customer of that web page have an Office 2000 license, even though they'd really never installed the Office web components on their machine. Indirectly, they were still using the Office 2000 web components. Of course, it's awfully hard to enforce the Office 2000 license requirement if your goal is never to install anything on the machine. You can't. That leaves you with no way effectively to tell. There's really effectively no way to tell on a lightweight web page whether someone's got a valid Office 2000 license, and thus, you really had no way to enforce the Office 2000 license, and that's kind of a deal breaker. So in a lot of ways, that licensing issue was fairly tricky and caused a lot of people to not use the Office web components because they had no easy ways to enforce the license. So with Office 10, we've tried to address the licensing issues that, for example, were caused by the fact that it wasn't easy to detect whether someone had an Office 2000 license. So what we said with Office 10 is that the components are redistributable anywhere. This means that you can do everything in your power to install the Office 10 web components. You don't have to say, well, do they have an Office 2000 license? Because if not, I can't install it. You can install them anywhere. However, the Office 10 web components have a view-only mode. What this means is that if someone doesn't have an Office 10 license, we still won't let them do interactive things with the Office web components. Effectively, what that means is your spreadsheet object becomes read-only. You can't do things like do new sorts or do new filters on top of it. Your charting object, for example, there's no support for pivot charting if you're in view-only mode. And the pivot table component as well also goes into sort of a view-only mode where you can't do additional groupings, you can't do sorting or filtering or those kinds of things based on your Office 10 web component. So the pivot table, but the Office web components have enough logic in them that they can look for an Office 10 license, and if there is one, they'll turn themselves on and be fully interactive. Now note that the way we detect an Office 10 license isn't just solely based on whether Office 10 is installed. What we do have is support for this object that can check for licenses and check for a licensing file. So, for example, a lot of corporations, they don't want to roll out Office 10 and install it on desktops, immediately after we launch. But they do want to use the Office 10 web components immediately because they're lighter weight components and there's less to worry about if you want to deploy them immediately. So, a big corporation which might have an enterprise agreement, they've paid for Office 10, they've got a license to it, but they haven't installed it yet. And for those corporations, what they could do is distribute these licensing files, which the Office web components can look for and say, okay, well, they've got a license, so we'll go interactive. Now, unfortunately, there is this other big caveat, though. Developers must enforce the fact that if a person doesn't have a license, we can't give them interactive behaviors. Now, that's a really on-your-honor kind of tough thing to do. But basically what it means is a developer has to say, okay, I'm going to develop an interactive interface with custom HTML that basically drives a pivot table component or a chart component. But what that developer has to do is say, okay, well, I'm going to check a property on the Office web component called, for example, pivottable.viewOnlyMode. And if that's set to true, then I have to enforce the fact that I don't allow interactivity. So I have to do my own disabling of the user interface in my web page that drives that Office web component. And that's a requirement of our Office 10 licensing story. So that does place a significant burden on developers, nevertheless. So while our licensing story is to a degree, a lot easier to work with than our Office 2000 licensing story, there still are a lot of caveats. Now, a lot of people, of course, what they really want to do with the Office 10 web components is be able to redistribute them freely, have them be interactive, and not require that you have an Office 10 license. People complain about the tie to Office 10. On the other hand, we kind of want to drive Office revenue with the Office 10 web components, so thus we still have the fundamental restriction that in order to use the Office 10 web components, you really have to pay for Office 10. Somewhat related to licensing issues are installation issues, because they go hand in hand. Can I install? Well, as I said, with the Office 10 web components, you're free to install the Office 10 web components basically on any machine you find. So basically, you don't have to do any kind of verification for licenses when you want to install. One of the problems that our installation story had in Office 2000 was that your installation ultimately required a link to a file share, and that file share had to have a full copy of Office on it, a full install of a full image of basically an Office 2000 CD. Now, not only is that kind of a little bit of an inconvenience because that means you have to reserve 600 megabytes for this image, it also means that internet installs don't work because you have to point to a file share, and file shares really don't work when you're in an intranet environment. If you're in an intranet environment, they do work, of course. Well, we've removed that requirement in 10, so thus we can support internet downloads. And of course, it means it's significantly easier for someone to quickly create a way for people to force a download of the Office 10 web components. What we don't support anymore is a code base install. So what that means is in Office 2000, we took advantage of Internet Explorer features that allow you to say, if I don't detect this web component, I'm going to start up and install that, would install that for them. The reason that we don't have code-based installs anymore is that it's a really kind of a cumbersome, the way we implemented it was fairly tricky and had a lot of issues, because what we would essentially do is install enough of the Windows installer so that we could actually link back to that file share and start up an instance of Office 2000 setup. So because that mechanism was fairly complex, and it was also tied to our notion that we need to link back to a file share, we got rid of it. So what that means now is that you actually have to link to an installation executable. That installation executable is basically a subvariant of Office 10 setup.exe, and will allow you to kind of individually install the Office 10 web components. The good news is that the Office Web Components redistributable will be available on office.microsoft.com, kind of the new version of Office Update. So that means that you don't even have to necessarily do a heck of a lot of work to repackage the Office Web Components or design your own setup.exe. You can basically, for example, just link off to this office.microsoft.com website, and your customers can download the Office Web Components on their own. Now, the Office 10 Web Components, the installation for them is fairly lightweight. What it basically involves is you install the Office Web Components, and you also install a special version of the pivot table services that ships with SQL Server 8. Now, when I say special version of SQL Server pivot table services, what I mean is a version that fixes bugs since the release of SQL Server, but it's not their SR1. So it's kind of in between the release version of SQL Server and SR1. Now, of course, SR1 bits of the pivot table services will also work, but for now, we've got our own kind of special version of SQL Server pivot table services. Those are the two things that get installed when you go, for example, to office.microsoft.com and then do a single install of the Office Web Components. However, there is still the need to ensure that Microsoft Data Access Components MDAC 2.5 bits are installed in a machine. The install on office.microsoft.com doesn't force the installation of these. So thus, the burden still is a little bit on the intranet or local IT group to make sure that, for example, there's the correct MDAC bits are installed on the machine. Now, of course, when you install the Office Web Components via Office 10 setup proper, of course, we do a check at that time to make sure that the MDAC bits are installed. So it is something that you need to worry about. If you're going to link off to office.microsoft.com, do the machines in my organization, are they all Windows 2000 machines, or are they all Windows 98 machines that have MDAC 2.5 on them, for example? Somewhat related to installation is the question that a lot of developers have is, if I install the Office 10 web components, will I break existing solutions that I've developed using the Office 9 web components? Well, we've really tried to learn from issues like DLL hell and trying to evolve web components. So we've done a lot of work to make sure that the Office 10 web components don't break existing solutions that are based on Office 9. So what that means practically, for example, is that our program ID, our prog ID, for the Office Web Components is completely different from the Office 9 web components. So there's no way that someone could, for example, once they install the Office 10 web components and then they navigate to your web page, which is based on Office 9 web components, that they'd start using Office 10, and then maybe you'd get issues and breakages associated with that. So we've really tried to keep them separate. We've even gone to the point of we include the Office 9 web components in the Office 10 setup. So if you've built a lot of solutions using the Office 9 web components, but you're trying to phase out Office 2000, well, at least with Office 10, you can still install the Office 9 web components. So we've been trying to be as careful as possible about making sure that we don't break existing solutions. That said, we do install a new version of pivot table services, and it still is possible, though not likely, that a solution developer might have specified a independent version of SQL Server pivot table services, and thus, when they install the web components, all of a sudden that solution will point to SQL Server 8 pivot table services and start using those, and that may cause issues. Although generally, the SQL Server 8 pivot table services are an evolution of SQL Server 7 pivot table services, and it shouldn't cause problems. So as I mentioned, we support side-by-side installation with Office Web Components 9. So I'm starting to wrap up. If you're looking for more information on the web components, we do have a website called HTTP Whack OC Web. What there is on that site is a lot of samples. There's also some walkthroughs. So I've described all the features here in this presentation, and I've kind of given you the laundry list of new features. But if you go to HTTP Whack OC Web, we've got actually walkthroughs that you can do. So assuming you've got the Office 10 web components installed, you can actually go through and see all the features that we developed, like 3D charting, like pivot charting, those kinds of features. We've also got a lot of code samples there. So if you're wondering, well, gee, how do I, for example, use an ad hoc grouping in my pivot table solution? Well, there's probably a code snippet there that you can use that should be straightforward, that you can leverage. Not listed here, there's also an alias for your questions, OWC talk. So you can basically send email to that alias and get questions answered. I will say very briefly, what we're also planning to do in the future is we're planning to do kind of an Office 10 tool pack, which basically is an additional set of features that are not demos, but better than demos. They're tools that you can reuse with your Office 10 web components. So a good case in point is drill through. Drill through is a SQL Server 2000 feature that we don't support, but we do have this fairly evolved demo that uses an HTML behavior that sits on top of the pivot table component and can give you drill through features. And that's kind of a demo, kind of a tool that people would really like to get their hands on. So in the future, probably a few months after we ship Office 10, we'll have this tool pack which contains a lot of little solutions that people really look for and are part of our common set of questions asked, and that solve some problems, and also have been tested and also work fairly well. Our object model has changed significantly. We've added a lot more stuff, and as I mentioned, the spreadsheet component object model has changed fairly significantly. So if you're looking for documentation, the best source of information is OWC VBA 10.chm. If you do a search on your hard drive and you've installed Office 10, you'll find it. It's not, I'm not too familiar with how it's otherwise exposed, so I always have to tell people, well, do a search for this file on your hard drive. That's basically an object model tree, and it describes all the new methods and properties in our web components objects. And another favorite of ours is just the VB class browser, of course. And again, we do have a samples library on HTTP OC Web that describes them. Very briefly, I'll also discuss some frequently asked questions, as they relate to pivot table, because I work on the pivot table, and these are the questions we get the most. So one of the foremost questions is, what SQL Server 2000, what SQL Server 8 features do you not support in the pivot table? As I mentioned, we don't support drill through, which is the ability to say, okay, for this given total, it looks really high. The sales figure is really high, but what's the underlying data that might explain as to why it's so high? So SQL Server 2000 has a feature called drill through, which basically allows you to get to that underlying data, but the pivot table doesn't natively support it. So that's one feature we don't support, and as I mentioned, we do actually have a tool that works to do drill through in a very seamless manner, which we'll make available later on. Actions is another SQL Server 2000 feature whereby we don't support it natively, although there will be a demo that shows you how to do actions in conjunction with the pivot table component. Another feature for which we might not actually do a demo is write back. So in an OLAP cube, you can basically write back to the cube and have that data kind of redistribute amongst your Office web components. Another question that people often ask is, well, I want to take a pivot table and I want to print it. Printing is still obviously very common, and people want to print the data that they have. Unfortunately, our scenarios for pivot table are focused on trying to get it to work as a solution within Internet Explorer. And first of all, there are some limitations in Internet Explorer, like for example, there's no horizontal pagination, and implementing printing natively within the pivot table component was also really complex. So there's unfortunately probably one of our biggest current holes with the Office 10 web component is that there's really no seamless way to do printing. What we actually have done, however, is do an add-in and demo, which basically can extract HTML data from the pivot table component, and then it instantiates a copy of Excel, pours that HTML data in, and then uses Excel's printing features like print preview to basically allow you to print that data. It's actually a really good demo, and it works really, really well. So we'll have that add-in and demo available, and probably put it into our Office 10 tool pack. And it is available now. The only problem with the printing demo is that it's basically a DLL. that automates Excel, and as such, thus requires all the issues of, well, is the DLL going to be on the machines of the people that I want to have to be able to print pivot tables with? And features that I also haven't yet mentioned are, we do have a new chart data sheet. The reason I didn't mention was they didn't necessarily directly tie into the scenarios that I outlined of solution developers taking the components and building business intelligence solutions. So the chart data sheet actually, the chart control now has a data sheet. So for example, you can insert a chart into a front page, and rather than having to bind to data or those kinds of things, you can actually open up the property pages and start typing into a data sheet. And that allows you to build a chart on the fly. Very similar to using Microsoft Graph, for example, if you want to create a very quick and dirty chart within PowerPoint, for example. So the chart data sheet allows you to build charts within front page without having to do it. Another feature I haven't mentioned was pivot table updatability, which didn't necessarily tie into the kind of the business intelligence scenario. But pivot table updatability is a fairly big feature that basically allows you to go against a relational data source and update data. So add new records, delete records, and change the data within those records. In a lot of scenarios, this will allow you to take the pivot table control and for example, use it as basically a very simple way to kind of change data in the database. This feature is also used extensively within Access data pages. So that really wraps up the list of features that we have that we've gone over. Again, targeting two very core scenarios, doing calculation on the server side, and doing business intelligence solutions for using the chart and pivot table components. Again, our emphasis is that people will take our controls and develop their own custom solutions, and thus we've really focused on programmatic features and making it easy for developers to reuse our controls. Thanks.